And it's great that walking along the street, just in the last couple of hours, I've had people come up to me and saying how much they love the film.
Which I'm thrilled to hear.
Yeah, congratulations to Robert. Did everybody here see it, or no? Yeah, most people. Yeah. Anyway,
Thank you.
There's tomorrow's your next chance. Doesn't have a distributor yet, so that might be your last.
Tell your
chance.
uncle.
Yeah, tell any film distributors you know. Tell them. There was a thought running through my head as I watched the film. And I want to direct it at, and also, by the way, we've given a round of applause to Robert for his film, but we need a round of applause for Ashley. My goodness, what, I mean, this is my second year, and it's just, it's a fantasy come to life.
What is the film?
Oh, film in Newport and the Great Folk Dream.
Thank you.
It played this morning and it's playing tomorrow.
Thank you.
And Robert is the director. And as I was watching it, I mean, one of the things I kind of prodded Ashley to have this conference here, this conversation, because I thought just the Q&A at the end of the screening wouldn't be enough to cover all that this film implies and means in the history of American culture. Because it focuses on 65 when Bob Dylan went electric and, the world changed. And I've always taken the view that the first chords of Maggie's Farm on Sunday night, 65, was the beginning of rock. That was when pop music and rhythm and blues and all these different forms, and in those days you never heard the word. Rock was not a word, rock was a stone. And there was rock and roll, but there wasn't rock. But you remember at that time in 65, the Beatles and the Stones dressed nicely, with blue jackets and ties, and they sang about love. And here's this guy in front of a powerful blues band singing about what the hell is Maggie's Farm? What is that? And dressing like however he felt like when he rolled out of bed that morning. And that is the starting pistol I've always felt. And the festival culture that grew up in the wake of that, with Woodstock and Monterey and Glastonbury and all of that. But what I was thinking as I was watching it was that the intimacy of what we saw in your film and the acoustic music and the relationship between people who were so there to listen, that in a way, what we're seeing, what we're experiencing here in Knoxville is coming full circle to the spirit of what Newport Folk was at the time. So I was wondering, Ashley, how conscious were you of Newport and the folk, that world? Did you see festival? How aware have you been?
I was actually very aware as a kid. I didn't attend them, but I think the first one I was aware of was Newport Jazz.
Right.
And that was primarily because my father had Ellington at Newport, which was a record that I dearly loved, when I was very, very young. And I don't know when I started wondering what the Newport Jazz Festival was, but that's the first recollection I have. And then my cousin had a record. Gosh, I should have done some research before this. My cousin had a record that I think was recorded at Newport 64 that had like Buffy St. Marie and Pete
Right.
Seeger.
On Vanguard,
And so, you know, that, because of her, that music was kind of on my radar, you know, when I was like 9 or 10 years old. And then it just keeps going. You know, there's the Monterey film,
Right.
and Woodstock. And after that, I think I was certainly, even though I'd never attended a festival, still at that time, I was certainly hooked on this idea of what a festival could be.
And how did that relate? Was Bonaroo the first festival that you produced?
No, there were some much smaller attempts. One of them was actually, you know, doesn't really count. It was here at the World's Fair Park for a couple of days. Well, that would have been about 97 or 98, I guess. And then we did the prototype for me on Bonaroo. Was a festival we did up in the mountains near Asheville, North Carolina, in a place called Deerfields that we call Mountain Oasis, and that was 2000. Yeah, it was 2000. It was 2 years before Bonaroo, but that's when I realized that there was actually an audience that was hungry for that kind of experience. It was a camping festival like Bonaroo. It was much smaller. It was we capped it out at 6,000 people, but I'm pretty sure we turned away 10,000 people, you know, who wanted to come and couldn't make it in. And in many ways, you know, the blueprint for even what we did at Bonaroo was in place. You know, we had Cubanismo play that festival, if I remember correctly, and you know, Bella Fleck and the Flecktones, and I can't even remember.
Was the one in the mountains, not Bonaroo?
This is the one in the mountains.
Right.
So this was in 2000, and then, but that's when, you know, the feeling that there was that hunger, you know, and interest, because, you know, the conventional wisdom in the music business here in the States at that time was that that American audiences did not want to go to festivals.
Did not want.
Did not want to go to festivals.
I never met that audience.
Yeah, they did not want to go to rock festivals in particular. And I think it had a lot to do with the checkered history of rock festivals and their relationship with the communities that they took place in. Because obviously, you know, I mean, certainly in this area, there were bluegrass festivals galore, jazz festivals, New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival was happening. But as far as like doing a full-on camping rock festival, that was considered to be a really stupid idea when we launched it, which is, you know, in a way, that's what allowed us to get away with it.
Was Bonaroo a camping festival?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, the first year in particular, 100%, 70,000 people. There may have been a few hundred people who were staying in hotels, but that was it. So.
And what was the musical aesthetic of Bonaroo, the imprint, the sort of?
The musical aesthetic of Bonaroo, well, we were labeled a jam band festival.
Right.
So it was, you know, the offspring of the Dead, you know, Phil and Friends. At one point, the remainder of the Grateful Dead came. Fish was on hiatus at the time, but Trey played. Widespread Panic was a linchpin the first few years. String Cheese Incident, but we didn't consider ourselves to be a jam band festival. We just considered to be the jam band culture. We just considered that to be a great basis to build a festival around. Because from my perspective, being a jam band didn't really mean anything except that you had, you know, your shows were different each night. You know, many of them had very devoted followings that were more inclined to camp in a field than maybe many audiences. but they're also influenced by a lot of different kinds of music. So, you know, you have jam bands that are very influenced by bluegrass, jazz, all sorts of music from all over the world, rock. And so it was also following those tangents, you could build a festival that had a lot of diversity around it as well.
And you got some of those jam band roots playing here this year.
We do, yeah.
Medeski.
Yes, Medeski.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah, Medeski. I mean, Dave Harrington, the guitar player, is a major Deadhead, and really in exploring that whole world in a really unique and different way. I mean, Thurston Moore's a Deadhead, so that influence is more present, I guess, this year than ever before. But there's been elements of it before that. You know, I mean, it's a really important part of our culture. It's you know, that whole aesthetic, I think, is you know, very much tied into the appreciation of live music for me.
Yeah. And does it have a new generation, or is that sort of passing through into an older demographic?
I think I'm too old to answer that.
Robert, can I ask you, in getting ready to make this film, do you have a history of festival going?
I do. My history of festival going, I'm a West Tennessee boy, and it's just thrilling to be here in East Tennessee and see what you've done. And really also, I haven't been in Knoxville in many years, and just to see the way the town has embraced its downtown, you know, and it doesn't try to tear down everything at the first chance it gets. It realizes that a place that has a feel and a historical feel is something to appreciate, yeah. And Memphis ain't got that. But in Memphis, when I came up, I started going to festivals in Memphis in the 70s, and I didn't realize it until making this film. I'm going to step back once, and then I'm going to step back twice. The double step back is to say, Joe didn't get a proper introduction, and I want to make sure everybody here knows who Joe Boyd is. You may not know Joe's name, but he's all over your record collection. I assure you, almost no matter who you are. Joe's a famed record producer, label owner, Hannibal, and book author, and is doing a couple presentations here on that's connected to his latest book, The Roots of Rhythm Remain.
That's right.
And yeah, so, you know, I think we all have come to where we are in part because Joe helped us get there. So now to step forward once, the Newport Folk Festival was produced by George Wein. He got into it because he was a club owner, then he started to produce a jazz festival in Newport, and when, as he says in our movie, Newport and the Great Folk Dream, playing at 11 a.m. tomorrow, that folk got on the rise, and he realized there would be a good weekend. It could lead to a good festival too. So he began planning this folk festival. Later, people in New Orleans reached out to George Wein and said, "Hey, we want you to help us put on a festival in New Orleans," which became the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival. The Jazz and Heritage Festival had a lot of influence in the region, and when I was in high school in the mid and late 70s, I started going to festivals in downtown Memphis where I loved the experience because it was 4 stages, and I might have known some names, but mostly it was music I didn't know. And what I really grew to appreciate was how a festival, a well-curated festival, could expose me to so many things. One of my, like a great example is, I heard a great blues band in Memphis at this festival, and I hollered down, hey, where do y'all play? And the guy said, J&J Lounge, Friday nights. I went home to the phone book, J&J Lounge. Oh, here it is on Mississippi Boulevard. Where's that? I got out a map, and I found my way there, and I got exposed to the Fieldstones, a Memphis group, who I continued to see, and who really led like a blues subculture in Memphis, for the next 25 years. So a good festival can do that, and that happened, and I really think that it's a direct line from George Wein to my going into the J&J Lounge, and this is not germane to this, but it's a funny little story real quick. Hot summer's night, my friend and I arrived with a fifth of bourbon, and it was so hot we said, hey, let's get a couple beers and cool off. And at the Blues Lounge we said, 2 beers, 2 quarts. So we quickly became the most popular table in the club. But I think that a festival is ideal for getting exposed to music that you're not familiar with. It opens up doors, and and I think Big Ears is a great example.
Yeah.
Well,
Definitely.
and it's great that you give a shout out to George Wein. I can't tell you how many people in the music business I meet, and we start talking about early days and how did we get in the door into the music industry, and they say, well, I worked for George Wein for a couple of years. So many people work for George Wein. And George, you see him in the film. He played piano, he was a jazz piano player, but he was bald and fat and, looked like a cartoon cigar chomping exploitive agent. And so he's had sometimes a little bit of a rough ride from history because people don't quite believe in a way. He was such a benign influence. He just, Jewish kid from Brockton, father ran a tailoring or clothing store in Brockton, Massachusetts. And he went to BU and was by that time already a jazz fan. And he just saw this basement that was empty, and he rented it. And he called it Storyville, and it was a jazz club. And then one day into the jazz club came this woman who became a regular, and she turned out to be the daughter of the Lorellards, who some of you are old enough to remember P.J. Lorillard tobacco on the side of Salem cigarettes and Winston cigarettes and lots of cigarettes. They were billionaires, and she was a jazz buff, and she had a huge mansion in Newport, Rhode Island. And she said to him, why don't you bring some jazz some weekend, bring it down to Newport? All my friends, all my society friends would love that. And so a jazz festival was born, and then the jazz festival did really well, and then George had this, okay, folk is getting big. This was 1959, and so I think 58 he had a little folk concert as part of the jazz festival, and then the next year he had a separate weekend for folk, and he hired all the commercial folk people at that time, the Kingston Trio and Bob Gibson, and there was a historic moment when Bob Gibson invited the 19-year-old Joan Baez up on stage, and she stole the show, and that made her a star. But George was so smart and so sensitive. He realized that the folk business wasn't the jazz business. That there was a spirit, political spirit behind it, and an egalitarian spirit behind it, and that just to book artists and throw them on stage and charge money for the tickets and pay the artists their fees wouldn't cut it in the long run in the world of folk music. And so he shut it down, and he called Pete Seeger, and he said, what should I do? And Pete Seeger had this idea of forming a board and creating a nonprofit. And so it was dead, it was dormant for 2 years. And then in '63, they relaunched it as a nonprofit with the choice of artists determined by this board and some experts that they hired. And everybody, all the musicians got paid $50, no matter whether you were a headliner or an Appalachian fiddler who hadn't played in public for 50 years. Everybody got the same. And George and the board hired George's company to produce it. And I worked for George, so I was the production manager at the Jazz Festival and production manager at the Folk Festival. And it was, an incredible experience. I mean, I owe so much to George, So it's great that we mentioned him. Anyway.
Godfather of the Godfather.
Well, he is, because I had a connection with George that came later after Bonaroo, but my partners in Bonaroo worked at New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival directly. I don't think they knew George personally, but certainly he was there.
And New Orleans is another great story about George, because people from New Orleans, businessmen and the city government, approached him when Newport was so successful. They said, well, New Orleans is the home of jazz, we should have a jazz festival. And so they approached George, and he said, well, we'd have to have open admission, to anybody of any color. And the first time they came, they said, well, that's too big an ask for us. So they went away, and then they came back. And they kind of said, okay, I guess we can deal with that. And then George came down to meet with them in New Orleans, and he came with his wife, who's African American. And, they went into shock, and the talks collapsed again. And then finally, he was able to, they were so desperate to get his advice and his expertise into how to do this festival, that they caved in and did everything he asked them to, including setting it up as a foundation, and with, every kind of person, who wanted to buy a ticket, allowed to buy a ticket, and, anyway, he was just, he never talked that way. He talked gruffly, he was like, get out of here, kid, But he was the most warm-hearted and wonderful person. So,
Tell about living in, like, the way y'all would come down to Newport and in the couple weeks or several weeks before to get it set up, and like how y'all lived there and where you lived.
well, what happened was when I was at college, I was at Harvard, and I was putting on blues concerts occasionally, a couple. And so when George was looking for a tour manager for a blues tour of Europe, he mentioned that he was looking for a tour manager to Manny Greenhill, who was a local promoter in Boston, who I had done some work for to try and get blues singers on time to a gig, and I'd done it, and they'd been on time. And so Manny said, I've got somebody. And he said to me, could you be in New York tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock? And I was looking for something to do when I got out of college, and desperate to go to Europe, where I knew they appreciated blues much more than they did in America. And so I said, yeah, and I jumped on a train. I walked into George's office, and he talked to me for about 20 minutes, and then motioned over to a desk and a telephone, said, go get me a bass player and get on the phone, you're hired. And so I worked for him on this blues tour, and then on the jazz tour in Europe. And then he said, well, if you're in America next summer, I'll make you production manager at Newport. So, age 22, I ended up as production manager at Newport Jazz and Newport Folk. And Newport Jazz was basically I lived in Newport for 6 weeks, 2 months, in a little maid's closet, in one of the big mansions. But we got these huge Oldsmobiles to drive, given to us by a local Oldsmobile dealer. And I got warmed up for what happened at Newport because, you know, the radios were so great in those days. You know, AM radio in a car, a big car with a heavy car, with speakers in the doors, you know. And you turn on WPRO in Providence, which is the top 40 station. And all that summer, we heard Mr. Tambourine Man by the Byrds. We heard Like a Rolling Stone by Dylan, 6 minutes long. Nobody had ever released a single 6 minutes long. And you heard I Got You, Babe by Sonny and Cher, where Sonny was imitating Dylan. And so it was like the conflict, the crisis that happened that summer was ordained. Because it just suddenly, Dylan was a giant in commercial show business. You know, it was just huge. He was towering over everybody. And you just knew that there was no way to really fit this in to the aesthetic of the Newport Folk Foundation and the ideal of having Eck Robertson appear after 50 years and play his violin. And but actually, since seeing the film, and there was a moment in the film which I suddenly got something that had been slightly missing, because Pete Seeger always said afterwards, he said, he wrote me a letter years later, because I did an interview. I talked about him being freaked out on that night. He wrote me a letter saying he wasn't against electric guitars. He was just, you couldn't understand the words. And the truth is that he was kind of, you know, because actually in the film, A Complete Unknown, I assume most of you have seen that, which I thought wasn't bad. And I thought it did pretty good justice to what went on. And there was a shot that I thought was so cool and so clever. In 1964, when Dylan was there at the festival, and he meets Johnny Cash. And there's a scene with Dylan and Johnny Cash off on the wings to the side of the stage, but the camera stays on the stage and you only see Dylan talking to Cash in the corner of the shot. In the middle of the shot is a set of drums. Johnny Cash's drum kit says the Tennessee 3 on the bass drum. And it's like saying, yeah, there were drums on stage in 1964, a year before Maggie's Farm. And there were. And, you know, Muddy Waters had been there. And
John Lee Hooker played electric.
Yeah, exactly.
Before that, lots of people.
But what Pete Seeger was right about, the sound of Dylan that night in '65 was so loud. And I'd asked as a favor my friend Paul Rothschild, who was a great producer. He produced The Doors, he produced Janis Joplin. He mixed the sound. I was on stage, he was in the sound controls. And I think there was no real intention to get something so shockingly loud. And it's always been one of those things in the back of my mind, like, why did we make it so loud? You know, like, and what I realized, seeing that interview in your film with Mike Bloomfield, you know, was the guitar player for the Butterfield Blues Band. And he was a real gung-ho kid. I mean, he was really excited and he was outgoing and he was flamboyant. And the Butterfield Band was now managed by Albert Grossman, and so Dylan and Grossman and Butterfield figured, okay, we'll use this band to back Dylan when he plays some electric stuff at Newport, which is what he decided to do. And And in the film, there's this shot of Bloomfield kind of very vehemently dismissing the whole purity of the authentic folk people and the people who were worried about electric instruments and all this stuff. Bloomfield was on, he was hyped up. And in 1965, on stage, there was no direct input of electric instruments into the sound system. It all came through the amp. There were no monitors. And so Bloomfield at the sound check cranked his guitar up so loud. And basically Rothschild had to mix everything to balance with Bloomfield's guitar. And so in a way, it's the revolution that we saw is all down to Mike Bloomfield. and how loud he turned his guitar. Because if he hadn't turned it up that loud, the whole thing would have been a little more moderate. And might not have outraged everybody.
Which is kind of what happens in the afternoon. The afternoon before Dylan's electric set, Butterfield Blues Band plays, and you can hear in the movie that the sound people are not ready for this.
Right.
That you see Butterfield having a problem with the mic, getting heard over Bloomfield's guitar, and so I think that in a way, I don't know if Rothschild was on that afternoon stage,
probably not.
but they encountered.
No, actually, he probably was, actually.
They encountered the problem first, that, there's more volume here than we can handle. How are we going to deal with this? So I think, in two ways, Bloomfield was responsible.
And I remember at that workshop, blues workshop, there were other workshops nearby. And people from the other workshops came over and said, hey, guys, can you turn it down? and yeah.
Since the dawn of time.
But there's one shot that I don't know whether it exists in the footage, and I think it works perfectly the way you did it. But there's a missing piece in the Sunday narrative because at the end you show somebody says Mel Lyman picked up a harmonica and started playing Rock of Ages. And there's two parts that are missing from that. First is that Pete Seeger, I saw Pete Seeger coming after he came back from the parking lot because he couldn't stand to hear Dylan's thing. I saw him in the back, in the musicians' tent. The young musicians were on one side and the older musicians were on the other, and nobody was talking. People were crying, but nobody was talking. And the first communication between the generations that I saw off in the corner was Pete Seeger and Mel Lyman. And Mel Lyman was a really weird guy. He was a very good harmonica player. He was a member of the Queskin Jug Band. But he had told them that weekend that he was leaving. And his new position, he was going to move to Woodstock, where he was to become Albert Grossman's marijuana curator. And he was a real connoisseur of dope of all kinds. And so he was leaving. But this unlikely combination, I said, what are Pete Seeger and Mel Lyman talking about? And Mel Lyman later would start a cult called the Avatar Cult and be suspected of various murders. Seeger came up to me after this conversation and said, when the lights are down, when the thing is over, I want a single microphone left live, and I want you to give it to Mel. So they had decided together what would happen. That Mel would sit on the edge of the stage with the microphone. And the reason why it was so touching, one of the reasons, you see in the film, you see the finale of the 63 and 64 festivals on Sunday night. Everybody joining hands and singing We Shall Overcome. Freedom Singers, Dylan, Baez, Seeger. The finale of the 65 festival, nobody was up for singing We Shall Overcome. No one wanted to do it. The young and the old were completely on opposite sides. There was no spirit to do that. And George Wein was desperate, like, we gotta have a finale. And in the end, he went around and recruited Sam Lay, Butterfield's drummer, formerly Howling Wolf's drummer, and Jerome Arnold, bass and drums. George played piano, and Spokes Mashiane, who you see is the South African penny whistler, he was on stage. He didn't know what was going on. And a couple of other people were, and they sang When the Saints Go Marching In. And it was shambolic. It was horrible. Out on one side, and the security, backstage security had broken, nobody cared. And there was a huge, burly disc jockey from one of the local radio stations who'd gotten backstage, didn't have a pass. And he was up on stage, and he and Joan Baez were doing the jerk on one side of the stage. It was ugly. It was horrible. And you know, it was just so depressing. And so when Mel Lyman picked up his harmonica and started playing this poignant melody, Rock of Ages, Cleft for Me, and he just played it over and over again with no improvisation, no variation, which was part of Mel's aesthetic. He later made a record. He persuaded Warner Brothers to let him make a record in which he sings classic American songs in the most boring monotone you could ever imagine. But it's beautiful what he did with Rock of Ages. And people just sat down where they were and listened.
So, you know...
Do you have that footage of When the Saints Go
Yes,
Marching In?
and it's not in the film.
I know, because it isn't fun.
It's not fun. Actually, I believe that in the very beginning of the film, where there's 3 shots of a climax, it's during your monologue that opens the film. We actually have some of that footage in there,
Okay.
but it's not to that music. We just use the image. But talking about Rock of Ages, that was, you know, this sort of you know, mythical incident that had occurred, and these kind of films can't happen without the existence of this footage. So 2 shout outs, you know, one to Murray Lerner for being on site and recognizing the importance of documentation and of organizing the shooting over those 4 years. And then, of course, footage existing is one thing, but footage surviving is something else. And shout out to my producer Joe Lauro over here from Historic Films, because he found the Rock of Ages audio. That audio had never been heard. So he found that, and he found the Howlin' Wolf footage, and he found the Bloomfield audio so that we could blend the picture and the audio the way it's supposed to be. Same with Wolf. So, you know, those kind of, I learned early on, I don't remember what spurred me to become a documenter, but I knew that, you know, that documentation is, it's history. And I am not a good archivist, but I appreciate good archivists.
One of the things that I feel about that moment, and that sort of, in a way, is a trigger for this conversation, is I do know that that night, we were conscious, everybody there knew that the world was changing on this moment, that nothing would be the same. And I remember feeling very sad about what was being lost, but also very excited about the future. And 3 weeks before, there had been one of the greatest Newport Jazz Festivals ever. Friday night, I will never forget. It was Thelonious Monk, John Coltrane, Miles Davis, Art Blakey. You know, it was just unbelievably good music. Saturday night, Count Basie Orchestra under the baton of Quincy Jones, with special guests arriving by helicopter, Frank Sinatra. And it felt like jazz was at the height of its success, in a way, since the 30s. You know, it was almost coming back to where it was. 6 months later, jazz clubs all over the country were closing and becoming rock clubs. Folk clubs all over the country were closing and becoming rock clubs. Kids who normally, in the normal course of things, would have, by the time they got to be 20, they would have bought a turtleneck and a beret and be smoking Gauloises and snapping their fingers to Monk, were deadheads. You know, or they were, in a couple of years anyway, they were deadheads. And kids who were playing banjos and strumming guitars and wanting to be Pete Seeger, you know, in a couple of years, they were joining rock bands and playing electric guitars. The culture shifted so dramatically, and it became much more uniform in a way. Rock culture swept the board. You know, how old were you, if you don't mind my asking, in 1965, for example?
10.
10. Okay. So by the time you were 15, I mean, were you?
There had been a revolution. Yes.
What?
There had been a revolution.
Yeah.
And
But you still had why?
I mean, you kind of had a sense that something was going on. You know, when like Meet the Beatles came out, and the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show and stuff.
Yeah.
But you know, it was really a year or two after that it really starts galvanizing. And Dylan was part of that, of course, too.
Yeah. Well, it was that's 65. I mean, if you think about it, one of the things that is amazing, if you look at the parallel chronologies, is 3 weeks after Dylan at Newport are the Beatles at Shea Stadium, when they were still dressing like Beatles, you know, like mop tops,
Right.
and the girls were still screaming so loud they couldn't hear themselves play. And so these two cultural things were going in kind of in opposite directions. And the Beatles at the end of that tour basically said, that's it. You know, we're not going to do this anymore. We're going to wind this down. And so you have this incredible feedback loop across the Atlantic in which Dylan is so inspired by the Beatles that he wants to start playing electric guitar. And the Beatles are so inspired by Dylan that they want to stop writing love songs and start writing other stuff and doing other things, you know. And but rock culture became so all pervasive, it kind of carried all before it, that you know, that Woodstock and Altamont and Glastonbury and all these things felt to me a little bit, I don't know whether you have a different view of this, that it was a bit of becoming more of a monoculture. That there was more like one big thing that was sweeping the country forward, you know, at least the youth of the country anyway.
I think a lot of that has to do with television, because television was just getting into homes at that time. Radio had created a revolution, had begun to bring mass communication, and television put it into the heart of the home. And so that, you know, changed it. You didn't have to really leave the house to feel the change going on.
And actually, you said something the other night, which I think, in a way, you every action has a reaction. And so there was this unifying rock phalanx that swept all before it, But by the 70s, people like you were doing free-form radio shows in which you were playing Ravi Shankar and John Coltrane and Leonard
Right.
Cohen back to back.
Well, you know, I didn't. I don't know. You got me thinking about so many things I can't even like organize. You know, it does occur to me that how revolutionary Dylan's Like a Rolling Stone was. You know, in terms of subject matter,
Yeah.
the length of the song. You know, it's to this day just an extraordinary song, and it really it feels like a tipping point in many different ways. I personally did not experience things becoming a monoculture. In fact, quite the opposite, because for me during this time, you know, I had been raised listening to a lot of different kinds of music, and I just had the bug. But, you know, I remember like Rolling Stone, for instance, you know, they're certainly writing about Janis Joplin and Jimi Hendrix and Dylan and so on, but you also have articles about Ornette Coleman and John Coltrane and Sun Ra and you know, all sorts of, you know, different other aspects of the culture. And for me, that was extremely influential.
Right.
And, you know,
Well,
I
that's
mean,
by
Bob
the early
Palmer in
70s,
particular, you know, some of the stuff that Bob Palmer was writing back then.
But in a conversation we had last night, somebody pointed out, when we were talking about Ashley's freeform radio program, that what we're experiencing here is his radio programs made live.
I had a show called, I don't know if Knoxvillians may remember, but I had a show from on WUOT. I did jazz shows for a while, but I had a show on WUOT from like right around 79 or 80 for about 20 years. And it was called Unhinged. and in many ways, you know, somebody pointed out to me, I didn't really think about this, but somebody had pointed out to me a few years ago that Big Ears is sort of unhinged come to life.
Yeah.
So that's what we were talking about the other night. So.
But I think that's again what a festival can do is it's really ultimately about who's curating that festival.
Mm-hmm.
And so you know, what made you think that in the age of you know, just where, I mean, mass culture, monoculture, everything, what gave you the gumption to book such an esoteric lineup and imagine that, you know, you could fill a town for the weekend?
Well, I had no idea that it was going to become what it now is. And it started very, very modestly. My company at the time had started to manage the two downtown theaters, the Tennessee Theater and the Beachy Theater. So we had something of a responsibility of programming them as much as possible. But being a music fan and not just a promoter, I wanted to bring in certain kinds of music that Knoxville itself didn't have the population to support. And this included a lot of classic jazz, frankly. You know, bringing in, even a Sonny Rollins. It would sell pretty good, but it wouldn't sell out the Tennessee Theater, for instance. And this became kind of common. So I was interested first and foremost of how could I bring in some of these great artists and actually have an audience for them. And then there were a lot of interesting festival models in Europe that always captured my imagination. And then last but not least, you know, I remember standing in the field at Bonaroo watching acts like Radiohead or DJ Shadow or whatever, and you can hear the music of Philip Glass and Steve Reich, and DJ Shadow sampling Meredith Monk, and we had the festival bug. I was really interested in the idea of how you could, the kind of principles that you could organize a festival around, and one of them was following these influences that I happened to be aware of, but maybe not everyone was, and it was, it's just kind of an interesting idea to explore, and little did I know that there would be a lot of interest. Thank you for being here.
Hey.
Thanks for taking a chance. Maybe we should,
But it started. It's the first big years. I mean, there were just a few hundred people here, and the Bijou was the biggest venue, and I think we maybe had 4 or 5 venues that we used during that year. So it's grown organically and steadily, and in many ways, thanks to the influence of the audience, the artists who come, and everything, it evolves kind of with a logic of its own year after year, just from being open to those influences.
well, it's a wondrous thing. Can we is there anybody here who has a question from the audience? This gentleman.
Ashley, I was noticing when you're talking about when your radio show went to, it ended right around the time of Clear Channel, and the kind of, talk about curation, the kind of mass model curation of playlists of radio across the country. How much has Big Ears, Bonaroo, kind of the festival you've done, been in a response, whether consciously or unconsciously, to that kind of, American radio audiences, now music audiences? It's kind of the same 20 songs across all the radio stations across the country.
The question is how Ashley's Big Ears and Bonaroo responded or grew out of the Clear Channel and sort of monoculture of radio.
Modernization, yeah.
The modernization.
I don't want to say that it was irrelevant, but I didn't really think a lot about radio with either of the festivals. It was more about tapping into a community that already existed, and I think if there's one thing that made Bonaroo possible, it may have been, dare I say, the internet, and the fact that a lot of the artists who played the first Bonaroo in particular had pioneered using the internet to connect very directly with their own fans. And so they had opened this ongoing channel of communication. And this is long before social media, well, a few years before social media. And, but there were, I think they called them user groups, where people would talk about certain topics and so on. So the interesting thing about Bonaroo is we sold those 70,000 tickets that first year without spending a dime on advertising. And and we didn't realize that we weren't going to spend a dime. We just kind of stumbled on the reality that all of these artists were connected with their fans, and we mobilized the artists to tell their fans about this festival that they were going to be playing, and that captured everybody's imagination, and that was that. So it was an incredibly exhilarating moment. But so much of the music that was playing Bonaroo in those early days, it wasn't on the radio. It really wasn't part of radio culture at the time, and that did gradually change. But I don't know. I think the thing that I love about music festivals at this particular point, which Robert was alluding to as well, is the social aspect of it. The people coming together for a common experience, sharing a common passion. And, I think that, especially in our current culture, this this opportunity to be together as human beings in a single space and sharing these kinds of experiences, as the listening to recorded music seems to have become more and more and more of an isolated experience, is invaluable.
I'm curious where the footage was found and how did you come about knowing about it?
The question to me was, how did the footage for the Newport Folk Festival get found? Again, tipping my hat to Joe Lauro. He runs an archive in New York called Historic Films. Joe's responsible. Before I tell you that, I'll just tell you, Joe's the one who got the tapes out of the basement that became Summer of Soul. So there's that. And then Joe was trying to license some Howlin' Wolf footage from Murray Lerner. That's how he met Murray Lerner, the filmmaker. And over the next 20 years, Murray, as Joe said at the Q&A, was a tough cookie. They developed a relationship. Joe ultimately began to represent some of Murray's footage for licensing, and when Murray was ready to sell his Newport archive, Joe bought it. And Joe and I had begun cutting the footage that became Summer of Soul before that movie, and when it fell apart, we had enjoyed working together, and I got a call one day from Joe saying, I've got this other archive, you want to try that one? And I was like, hell yeah.
So, lady there, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. I go to Newport every year, so I appreciate it. I'm going to see the movie tomorrow. You talked about we listen and then we share and we tell everybody about music and we pass it on. But I was thinking that what I see with Big Ears, Ashley, is all these musicians, and I've seen it at Newport, that come together that maybe didn't know each other before. And then I see Dawes playing with Lucius, and I see Joni Mitchell playing with the High Women. And it seems to me that with Big Ears, there's a lot of musicians that I'm wondering if they didn't know each other before, and then they get together and start new things.
The question's about the way Ashley was talking about the audience coming together. She's asking about the musicians coming together and meeting each other and interchange and musicianship between
There's one of them right there, Shahzad Ismail. Pardon?
I have something to piggyback off that, exactly the same.
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I hope this isn't lifting the veil too much for anybody, but the thing is, as musicians, we unfortunately tend to have a negative attitude about festivals on tour. And this is because, hi there, hello. So, as musicians, I hope this isn't pulling the veil back too much, but as musicians, we tend to have a negative attitude about festivals on tour because we tend to, this is a generalization of course, but we tend to look forward to the club dates on a 10-day tour, because on those nights we'll stretch out, we'll play an hour and a half, nobody's before us, we're not stressed. And in our minds, the festival is the show where that helps get the tour happening, but inevitably the sound check's 10 minutes, the moment you're done, you're off 5 minutes later, and the audience may or may not be there to see you ultimately. And yet, there are certain festivals that stick out in my mind that oppose that model, and this is certainly one of them. And one of the primary reasons is it speaks to the woman's point that whether it's intentional or unintentional, some of the musicians tend to know each other and come from similar fields and similar walks of life. So we come to this festival as excited as all of you are. We're already on the app seeing who's playing, what friend is playing, or who that we don't know yet is playing that we've heard so deeply about. And it's surprising because many of us don't tend to leave the couch to go see concerts. That's the last thing we're doing. And at this festival, like a person like myself will be anxiously lined up 3 years ago to see Fuji, just like all the rest of you, and just hoping I get in the door. And then when I do, speak to him afterwards and make a point to go visit him in Tokyo and do some work together and that kind of thing. So a festival that causes interplay among the musicians, I think, very subtly shifts the tone for all of you, and it's deeply perceptible. And I really appreciate that.
Thank you for that. I think that's really a quality to this, for this festival that emerged organically. You know, to me, it was very affirmative to the vision of the festival that it was embraced the way that it was by the artist community as well as the fans. And if there's a secret sauce when it comes to curating the festival, it goes back to simply the word listen. And that means not just listen to the music, but listen to the interest of everybody that's going to be involved in making it, and the projects that they want to share that they maybe don't always get to share in their normal concert performing life. And it's I feel it's a real luxury. Really to just be in a position of helping to facilitate some of these collaborations.